Our final portion of the standard work is the official declaration to ending the priesthood restrictions on the African race in the church. Now, I'm going to do this video a little differently than previous ones, in that many years ago, when I was in college, I took a class on the history of 20th century America. And as my final project, I did my final essay on the lifting of the Priesthood Ban, the history of the Priesthood Ban and its ending in 1978. So rather than doing a video as I normally do, I am just going to read my essay. Isaiah wrote, "Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk, and drawn from the breast. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little." To members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this passage teaches that God reveals to men only that which they are ready for. In the early years of the LDS Church, God instituted a ban barring the African race from holding the priesthood and participating in a number of ordinances in the church. This was done when the slavery was still practiced and the race was held in bondage, a time when the church and the nation were not yet ready to accept the black race into full membership. This ban remained in effect and influenced the policies and practices of the church for over 100 years. During this time, few people of African descent joined the church, but those that did were among the most faithful of the membership. During the 1860s, the church came under pressure from all sides to end the ban. Yet it wasn't until 1978, well after the civil rights movement had died down, that the ban was finally removed. Since that time, the number of black members has continued to rise steadily, and these members remain some of the most faithful. So why did God wait until 1978 to lift the ban? It was because the country and the church were finally ready to accept the black race as equal citizens, and thus into full membership. So, just as Isaiah said, God waited until we were ready to remove the ban. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was organized on April 6, 1830 in upstate New York, with Joseph Smith as the first elder. Within the year, the members had begun moving to Kirtland, Ohio, where Joseph Smith would produce a translation of the Bible, as well as Egyptian papyrus scrolls. In both, there would be hints of the priesthood ban. In the book of Moses it is written, "And Enoch also beheld the residue of the people, which were the sons of Adam. And they were the mixture of all the seed of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain. For the seed of Cain were black, and had not place among them." In Abraham we read that Egypt was settled by a daughter of Ham, and thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land, and that Pharaoh was of that lineage by which he could not have the right of the priesthood. Besides these hints, there is no explicit record of the priesthood ban from the time that Joseph Smith led the church. It wasn't until the 1850s, when Brigham Young had become the president of the church, that we find official statements concerning the instituting of the ban. Brigham Young, when speaking to the territorial legislature of Utah in 1852, stated, "Any man having one drop of the seed of Cain in him cannot hold the priesthood. And if no other prophet ever spake it before, I will say it now in the name of Jesus Christ. I know it is true, and others know it." While this was not the only statement on this subject, nor even the first, it shows more clearly than any other the views of Brigham Young, and from that time the ban was strictly enforced. The ban included more than just restrictions on the priesthood, however. It is commonly referred to as the Priesthood Ban because that is its most outward manifestation. It also banned the African race from entering the temples or from holding positions in the church. These other elements are of importance to understand the true impact the ban had on all members. In the LDS Church, all worthy male members are ordained to the priesthood starting at the age of 12. This priesthood is required to officiate in all the ordinances of the church. At the age of 12, young men can begin to participate in the ordinance of the sacrament or communion. By the age of 16, they can baptize people into the church. At 18, they can confirm the baptism and confer the Holy Ghost. Later, they can perform the ordinances of the temple. For many members, it is a great joy to baptize their children or be baptized by fathers. It is a joy to see your sons participate in the sacrament. These things were denied to the African race. While they could be baptized and partake of the sacrament, they could not perform the ordinances, and thus someone else had to baptize their sons and daughters. The ban also barred the African race from entering the temples. In the LDS Church, the temple is the pinnacle of worship. Within the sacred buildings, the highest ordinances are performed. Among these are the endowment, when the members are endowed with power and knowledge from God. Then the Church teaches that the marriage and family relationships can last forever. Through this sealing ordinance, a man and wife can remain married even after death. Lastly, the temples are where the great work for the dead is done. This is the doctrine by which those who died without knowledge of the gospel can partake of it through proxy in the living. As Africans could not enter the temples, none of these ordinances were available to them. Not only could they not perform them, but they could not receive them. The last aspect of the ban is that those of African race could hold no position in the church. As most leadership positions are priesthood callings, this largely follows the ban from holding the priesthood. However, there are some other callings that do not require the priesthood but could not be held by the African race. These include callings in women and youth organizations and Sunday school. They could also not be called as teachers in any of the classes taught in church meetings. What made the people unprepared to accept the black race? Why did God feel that we were not ready? A brief look at some aspects of history show how the attitudes of the country, as well as the church, changed over the years. Understanding this change will show us the answers to these questions. Most of the history of race relations in the United States is commonly known, but let us look not only at the country as a whole, but as the church membership as well. Until the Civil War was won, the African race were enslaved in the South and generally treated as second class in the North. When the Saints left the country in 1846, they took no slaves with them. However, when Utah became a territory of the United States, slavery was made legal by popular vote. With the option of making it illegal, the members chose to accept the practice. The leaders of the church refused to comment on it, but did say that God approved either choice. During the period of Reconstruction, there had been some effort to improve the situation of the African race in the United States. However, by the end of the 1870s, the Democrats had muscled their way back into power in the southern states and began drafting new laws to push the blacks out. Poll taxes and literacy tests for voting were passed, and legal segregation pushed the former slaves back to their outskirts of society. While there were some attempts to combat this racism, it became the dominant legal theory of the time. With the pronouncement of the Supreme Court in 1894 that separate but equal was constitutional, the Jim Crow laws became fixed in the United States. This legal racism led to poor living conditions for the black race, low wages, and almost no legal recourse in the courts. The blacks were treated as second class and subhuman. Whether the members of the church generally shared these views is not easy to ascertain. Few studies have been conducted on this subject. However, we can see an attitude of keeping one's distance from the blacks. During the first half of the 20th century, there appears to have been a general custom for missionaries to not actively seek out black people. This is especially odd when one considers the massive missionary effort the church has engaged in from its founding. By this time, there were missionaries in most countries throughout the world, including China, Israel, Brazil, and many others. Brazil is especially worth noting, as a large portion of its population is at least part African. The reason for not teaching the black citizens was never fully explained, nor is there a record that the church leadership officially stated it. It was simply the way it was done. Missionaries avoided black neighborhoods. They did not try to start conversations with blacks that they met on the street. They never turned away those who came to them, but never sought them out. The missionaries are sent into the world to teach the people the gospel, and yet they were purposely avoiding this section of society. Whether these behaviors were due to personal prejudice or a misunderstanding of the church's policy is unclear, but in either case, this period was one of great racism in the country. In some ways, this seems to have spilled over somewhat into the church. After all, the members were Americans, and racism was very American at this time. In a study conducted by Armand Mauss in 1964, it was shown that members of the LDS Church follow the typical patterns for Protestant religions in regards to race issues. Regardless, these laws and attitudes show that the people as a whole were not yet ready to accept the African race as equal, either civilly or religiously. Though racism had been rampant in the first few decades of the 20th century, a change occurred in the 1940s. During World War II, there was a mass migration to the cities, both north and west. Many of those moving to the cities were blacks, seeking employment in factories that worked for the war effort. This brought a large black constituency into the north and west, It also brought many whites into more direct contact with blacks. This was true of the church as well. Evidence of the changing attitudes in the country was shown in the 1948 Democratic Convention when Hubert Humphrey, the mayor of Minneapolis, fought to have civil rights added to the party platform. In the previous year, President Truman had spoken out against the racial discrimination and was the first president to address the NAACP. In July of 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the armed forces. Yet these acts did little to actually improve the daily lives of black men and women in the nation. Almost in parallel to this, the leaders of the church issued the first official statement regarding the black race since the days of Brigham Young more than 50 years earlier. The migration to the West had caused a rapid increase of black residents in those states that were still dominated by the members of the church, like Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. With the members interacting with blacks on a more regular basis, many began to question the ban. They wanted to know why these good people could not hold the priesthood. Of course, this worked both ways. Many blacks learned of the church and became interested, but became wary when they learned of the ban. In response to this new sociality and questioning, the First Presidency issued a letter to the members in 1949. This letter contains the following statement. The attitude of the church with reference to Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of the declaration of a policy, but of direct commandment from the Lord, on which is founded the doctrine of the church from the days of its organization, to the effect that Negroes may become members of the church, but they are not entitled to the priesthood at the present time. Attitudes across the nation would continue to change. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement went into full swing. Many whites now joined the blacks in protest over the discrimination and racism throughout the country. Sit-ins, marches, and other peaceful demonstrations made the news. Many good people were shocked to see blacks being beaten on the news, and sympathy continued to grow throughout the country. The same can be seen in the church. One black woman told of her experiences in the church in the late 50s. She had joined the church only a few years before. One year her ward was invited to join a bowling league in their town. They happily accepted the invitation and prepared to participate in the following tournament. She and her family went with the ward to the bowling alley and were getting ready to play when a man approached them. He told them that blacks were not allowed to play in that alley. Not wanting to prevent the rest of the members from playing, she and her family left without complaint. She described the tears of joy she shed when, after getting outside, she realized that all the members had left with them, refusing to play without them. It took many years and many tragedies, but the United States showed its willingness to uphold the black race as equals. In 1954, segregation was declared unconstitutional, striking down the separate but equal ruling of 1896. In 1968, the United States had enacted the most sweeping civil rights legislation in 100 years. The people were clearly ready for a change. The desire among the leaders of the church for the ban to be lifted can clearly be seen. In 1969, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the second highest council in the church, held a meeting to vote on lifting the ban. In order for the resolution to carry, it had to be a unanimous vote of all members present. At the time, the full quorum was not present, as Harold B. Lee, who would later be president of the church, was away on church business. The resolution passed as the quorum voted to lift the ban. Clearly, these men wanted to extend the blessings of the gospel to their black brothers and sisters. Yet there was still one last test the church had to endure to prove itself ready, one that had already arisen. God's plan for us here on earth has been to prove us herewith, to see if we will do all things whatsoever the Lord our God shall command us. The ban was instituted by God, and so the final test was one of patience. Could we trust in God enough to wait for His direction and His command to lift the ban? In large part because of this, Elder Lee, when he returned and learned of the resolution of the other apostles, called the quorum together again and asked for a revote. In this, he spoke to the other members of the divine origin of the policy and declared that only through direct revelation could it be ended. The vote was taken again and was unanimously defeated. However, the clear desire still could not be fully contained, and later that year the First Presidency issued another official statement regarding the position of the black race. In this statement, they first addressed the concerns of the civil rights movement. They declared, "We believe the Negro, as well as those of other races, should have his full constitutional privileges as a member of society, and we hope that members of the church everywhere will do their part as citizens to see that these rights are held inviolate. While upholding these civil rights for all men, giving voice to their desires, they also pointed out that the priesthood ban was a religious matter and not a civil one. They explained, "We believe that this work is directed by God and that the conferring of the priesthood must await His revelation. To do otherwise would be to deny the very premise on which the church is established." This proved a trial for many, and some tried to force a change or simply disregard the ban. 2 men, Douglas A. Wallace and Byron Merchant, were excommunicated from the church for publicly speaking out against the policy. In Wisconsin, trouble arose after one ward decided to ordain black members to the priesthood as a form of protest. However, by and large, the protest from the church was less controversial, and the members continued to press the leadership for a lifting of the ban through letters. Many of the black members at this time voiced their belief that the ban would be lifted soon, and all they had to do was wait a little longer. Their belief proved true. After many years of patient struggles, the long-awaited revelation was given. In 1978, while praying together in the upper room of the temple, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 witnessed the will of God, and in June, an official statement was issued to the world, declaring the end of the ban. Few things have stopped the presses of the entire nation at once. But when this was made known, all newspapers, radio programs, and television stations were rushing to proclaim the news. Within hours, it had reached beyond the borders and was broadcast internationally. That October, it was unanimously accepted by all members of the church. God will never suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. For many decades, the black race was restricted in how they could participate in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They could not hold the priesthood or participate in the temple ordinances. This was instituted in a time when the white population of the United States was deeply and firmly racist towards the blacks. For it to be lifted, God required 2 things. First, that the nation and the church be willing to accept the black race as equals. And second, the church to be willing to obey the policy and be patient in waiting for Him to lift it. Both of these things had to be achieved, and when they were, the ban was lifted. The first was proven in the changing attitudes of the 40s and 50s and the passing of the civil rights legislation in the 60s. With the advent of the war and the migration of so many blacks into the North, the sentiments in the nations began to change. For over half a century, the laws had been designed to keep the blacks submissive. But in the late 40s, for the first time since Reconstruction, civil rights legislation was introduced to Congress. The road to acceptance would drag through the 50s and the civil rights protests. Brown versus Board of Education showed the nation that the government was now willing to act for the benefit of the black race. While the progress was slow, the Voting Act and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s proved the commitment of the government. While this did not end racism individually, it proved that the United States as a nation had changed. There was still progress to be made, but there would be no backsliding now. As part of the nation, the members of the church were certainly involved in the acceptance of the black race. However, they had to endure the second test of patience. Even as nations shut their borders to the missionaries, the church upheld the ban. When BYU could not schedule sporting events because of the ban, they began recruiting more black athletes, but the church did not lift the ban. When businesses and governments canceled engagements with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, the church simply accepted this. Even when the NAACP publicly criticized the church for it, the church did not change the policy. Even when members came out in open opposition, the church did not alter its position. For nearly 2 decades of such protest and pressure, the church waited patiently, and none with greater patience than those black members. God reveals His will as He sees fit, here a little and there a little, as Isaiah tells us, and He will never require anything of His children that they are not prepared to endure. For many years, the people of this nation were not prepared to accept the black race on equal terms, so God waited. When the nation was finally prepared, God tested the church to see if they were prepared to obey and follow His will. When they had shown their willingness, God decided it was finally time, and in 1978 the revelation was given, and the black race was finally brought into full participation in the gospel.
Recognizing Spencer W. Kimball as a prophet, seer, and revelator, and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is proposed that we as a constituent assembly accept this revelation as the word and will of the Lord? All in favor, please signify by raising your right hands. Any opposed by the same sign? President Kimball, it appears that the vote has been unanimous in the affirmative, and the motion has carried.